Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And we always try to bring you something new and interesting. And today we're looking at Mark 5:25 to 34. Um, I think a lot of pastors have probably preached on this a time or two. It's a familiar story.
hmm
The woman with the issue of blood who touches Jesus' garment and is healed.
Right, right.
But we want to go a little deeper. Like, how do you keep this passage fresh? How do you avoid the same old interpretations and really bring something new to your congregation? So we've been digging into a whole bunch of sermons on this passage,
Hmm.
looking at different approaches, different insights that other pastors have used.
Yeah, it's like a behind the scenes look at sermon prep. And it's amazing how creative some of these pastors get.
It really is. So get ready for some fresh perspective, some aha moments that will hopefully spark your own creativity for your next sermon or Bible study.
Absolutely.
What I found really interesting is how many pastors go beyond just retelling the miracle itself.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the wow factor of the healing,
hmm
but they really dig into the woman's situation. Like, imagine for a second, living in that time period and being in her shoes. She's considered ritually unclean according to Levitical law. People are avoiding her. She's isolated,
Right.
probably carrying immense shame.
Right. And that's something that a lot of the sermons really emphasize, that cultural context. Like they reminded people, this wasn't just a physical ailment she was dealing with. This made her a social outcast.
Yeah,
And it makes her act of touching Jesus even more daring.
it does.
And her faith, even more remarkable.
That's so true, because it wasn't just about physical healing then. It was about social and emotional restoration, too.
Absolutely.
Like, she was risking everything just for a chance to be made whole.
One pastor actually called it a bold reach,
Hmm.
like a desperate act of faith, but also incredibly courageous.
And speaking of faith, I loved how one pastor used this pop culture reference that I bet resonated with the younger people in his congregation. He drew on MC Hammer, Too Legit to Quit, to describe her 12 years of suffering.
Wow. 12 years.
Can you imagine? Like, she refused to give up hope. Her faith literally made her too legit to quit on seeking Jesus.
That's a great way to bring that ancient story into a modern context. And it really speaks to the power of perseverance, right? Like this woman's unwavering belief. It's such a powerful example for all of us today.
Oh, absolutely. It reminds me of another pastor who used the idea of yards after contact from football. When a player gets hit but keeps pushing forward for those extra yards, he applied that to the woman's journey, saying that faith is what keeps us going, even when life tackles us hard.
I love that analogy.
And then there were some really thought-provoking insights into the power of self-talk and faith declarations.
Yeah.
You know how the woman keeps saying to herself, if I just touch his garment, I shall be restored to health.
Right. It's almost like a mantra.
Yeah.
And one pastor used that to explore how our thoughts and words can actually shape our reality and even invite divine intervention. It's like she was speaking her healing into existence.
That's a powerful thought. It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of what we're saying to ourselves. If we're constantly focusing on negativity or defeat, it can really impact our faith.
Absolutely.
And speaking of staying positive and connected to the source of hope, one pastor used this brilliant analogy about phone chargers.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
He said, just like we need to keep our phones plugged in to stay powered up, we need to stay plugged into God through prayer, scripture, and community to keep our spiritual batteries charged.
Such a great image, especially for today's, tech-savvy audiences.
It really is. So simple but effective.
And it makes you think about, faith not just as a one-time event, but as this ongoing relationship with Jesus, a constant source of healing and renewal.
It's about staying plugged into that source of power and letting it flow through us. That reminds me of this one sermon that really focused on the phrase, go in peace, which Jesus spoke to the woman. The pastor pointed out that it wasn't just a casual farewell. It was an invitation to enter into this deep state of peace, a peace that comes from knowing you are loved, you are forgiven, and you are completely whole.
Yeah. Especially when you think about the weight of shame this woman was carrying. Those words, go in peace, must have been incredibly powerful. It's like Jesus was acknowledging her, validating her, and offering her a new beginning.
Absolutely. It reminds us that true healing isn't just physical, it's emotional and spiritual too. It's about stepping out of the shadows of shame and into the light of God's love and acceptance.
Right.
And speaking of shame, another pastor took that theme even further. He described shame as a cloak of invisibility, saying that the woman's condition in that culture probably made her feel so isolated and unseen. But by acknowledging her publicly, Jesus essentially removed that cloak
Mhm.
and offered her a new identity.
It's like he was saying, you are seen, You are valued, and you belong. That's a message that resonates with anyone who's ever felt marginalized or rejected.
It really does.
And, it makes you think about how we can do the same for people in our own lives.
Exactly.
Offer that same kind of grace and affirmation
Now,
to help them step out of the shadows and into the light.
that's a powerful challenge for all of us. And it's just one of the many insights we've uncovered in this deep dive into Mark 5:25 to 34. We've got a lot more to explore, so stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dig even deeper into this incredible story.
Looking forward to it. And it's interesting how some of the pastors explored the very nature of faith itself. Like one pastor argued that the woman's faith, even though it was based on kind of a misunderstanding of how Jesus' power worked, it was still enough to trigger her healing.
So even if our theology isn't, perfect, our genuine desire to connect with God can still open the door to miracles.
That's the idea. It's like God meets us where we are in all our messy, imperfect faith.
I love that.
But then it gets even more intriguing when you start to think about how faith interacts with divine sovereignty.
Ooh, this is where it gets really interesting for all you theology buffs out there.
Right. Several pastors tackled this age-old question of how does God's ultimate control work alongside our free will? And they use this passage to illustrate how our choices made in faith can actually impact God's plan.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. This woman, by choosing to reach out and touch Jesus, caused a shift in the divine plan.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how our own acts of faith, even the seemingly small ones, might be shaping the course of events in ways we can't even imagine.
Okay, now here's a fascinating detail you might have missed. One pastor pointed out something in the original Hebrew that adds a whole new layer to the woman's actions. He said she may have known about a prophecy in Malachi 4:2, which speaks of healing in the wings of the Messiah.
And get this, in Hebrew, the word for wings is the same word used for the hem of a garment.
So it's not just a desperate grasp anymore. It's deliberate, scripturally informed faith. It makes you wonder what other hidden depths are waiting to be discovered when we dig into the original languages.
Absolutely. And that's why studying the cultural and historical context is so crucial. It can unlock a whole new level of understanding.
Speaking of enriching our understanding, did you catch the sermon that referenced a medical journal article?
Oh, yeah, that was a clever one. The pastor was talking about this boy with a severe stomach condition who was miraculously healed after prayer. And he used it to illustrate that, healing miracles aren't just ancient history, they still happen today.
It's a powerful reminder that God is still at work in the world, and that he can intervene in even the most impossible situations.
I love how these pastors use such a wide variety of illustrations and analogies.
Me too.
It's not just, dry theological concepts. They bring the story to life with relatable examples. Phone chargers, football, even Fleetwood Mac.
Right. It keeps things fresh and engaging, helps people connect with the message on a personal level.
Speaking of connecting, one pastor used this analogy of a bridge to describe the woman's journey. Like, imagine a chasm separating suffering and isolation on one side and healing and wholeness on the other.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That gap between our current reality and what God has for us.
Exactly. And he said her faith was the bridge that allowed her to cross over.
It's a powerful image.
It reminds us that faith isn't passive. It's an active force that propels us towards transformation.
Another pastor took a deep dive into the Greek word for power using this passage. It's Dunamis, from which we get our word dynamite.
Oh, that one stuck with me. It's not just, some gentle force, but this explosive dynamic power capable of shattering limitations.
He used the image of dynamite blasting through rock to illustrate how Jesus' power can break through the hardest hearts and the most stubborn circumstances.
It's like the woman's issue of blood was a symbol of life draining away, and Jesus' dunamis, his explosive power, reversed that process and infused her with new life.
Powerful stuff. It makes you consider what areas of your life or your ministry need that kind of explosive breakthrough.
Right.
Now here's a thought-provoking question that came up in another sermon. What if the woman's touch wasn't just an act of faith, but also an act of worship?
I hadn't thought about it that way.
The pastor argued that by reaching out to touch Jesus' garment, she was acknowledging his authority, his divinity, his power to heal. It was her way of bowing down and saying, I believe in you, Jesus.
That adds a whole new layer of depth to her actions. It's not just about getting a need met. It's about recognizing who Jesus is and surrendering to his power.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what if our everyday acts of faith are also acts of worship, drawing us closer to God and releasing his power in our lives?
That's a beautiful way to look at it. And I was really intrigued by the sermon that touched on the already and the not yet in the kingdom of God.
Oh, yes. That's a tricky concept, but so important.
Right. The pastor used the woman's healing as like a tangible glimpse of the already, a foretaste of the complete healing and wholeness that awaits us in the future when God's kingdom is fully realized.
It's like a down payment on the future glory that awaits us. It gives us hope and encouragement to keep pressing forward, even when we're facing challenges.
What really struck me is how personal Jesus' encounter with this woman is. He didn't just heal her from a distance, he stopped, acknowledged her, and spoke directly to her.
It shows that Jesus cares about each of us individually. He sees our pain, hears our cries, and longs to connect with us. One pastor even suggested that Jesus' question, "Who touched me?" wasn't because he didn't know, but because he wanted to draw her out.
Give her a chance to share her story, her struggle, her faith.
Exactly. It wasn't just about performing a miracle. It was about restoring her dignity and her place in the community.
It's a powerful reminder that God isn't some distant, impersonal force. He's a loving Father who wants to engage with us, heal us, and restore us to wholeness.
Absolutely.
And it challenges us to approach our own ministry with that same level of compassion and personal attention.
Not just preaching sermons, but truly seeing people, hearing their stories, and offering them the healing touch of Jesus.
Speaking of seeing people, one pastor made an interesting observation about the contrast between the woman and Jairus, whose daughter Jesus also heals in this passage.
Oh, yeah. The two healings intertwined, one a social outcast, the other a synagogue leader, a man of status.
Yet both came to Jesus with desperate pleas, demonstrating that no matter our social standing or perceived righteousness, we all have needs that only Jesus can meet.
The gospel is truly for everyone.
And there was even a suggestion that the woman's healing foreshadows the inclusion of Gentiles into God's kingdom.
Right. She was considered ritually unclean, just as Gentiles were often viewed as unclean by the Jewish people. So Jesus' healing demonstrated that God's grace and salvation were available to all, regardless of ethnicity or background.
It's a beautiful reminder that in Christ, the dividing walls are broken down and we are all one.
And it challenges us to embrace that inclusivity in our own churches and communities. I have to share my favorite illustration. One pastor, talking about the woman's persistence, used the image of a dog with a bone.
I love that one. So vivid and relatable.
He said, just like a dog won't let go until it's gnawed at bone clean, this woman wouldn't let go of her faith until she received her healing. It's that relentless pursuit of God, that refusal to give up on his promises.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another pastor who compared her faith to a weed growing up through cracks in the pavement.
Oh, yeah.
It might get trampled on, but it keeps pushing through, it keeps reaching for the light. It's that kind of unyielding faith that we need to cultivate in ourselves and encourage in others.
Speaking of which, one pastor highlighted the societal risk the woman took by even entering the crowd. She was considered ritually unclean. Her touch could have made others unclean, according to the social and religious norms of the time.
Right. It's easy to overlook that aspect.
So she wasn't just risking her reputation, she was potentially breaking a serious taboo. That makes her actions even more daring.
It really does. And it highlights how her belief in Jesus' power was stronger than her fear of the consequences. It's a powerful reminder that true faith often requires us to step outside of our comfort zones, challenge the status quo, and yes, even risk rejection.
What do you think that looks like for us today? What risks might we need to take for the sake of following Jesus?
That's a great question for each of us to ponder. I think it might mean standing up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. It could involve reaching out to someone who's marginalized or rejected. Or maybe it's simply being honest about our doubts and struggles, even if it makes us vulnerable.
Those are all powerful examples. And
Right.
it reminds me of a pastor who used this really interesting analogy to describe the woman's faith. He compared it to a GPS system.
Oh, I remember that one. You talk about how she had a clear destination in mind healing, and she was determined to follow the spiritual GPS of her faith to get there.
Just like a GPS guides us through unfamiliar territory, her faith led her through the crowd, past her fears, right to Jesus. It makes you think about our own spiritual GPS. Is it set on the right destination? And are we trusting it to guide us even when the path seems uncertain?
Absolutely. And he made another interesting point. Just like a GPS recalculates when we take a wrong turn, our faith may need to adjust course along the way. But as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, we'll reach our destination.
That's encouraging for anyone who feels like they've gotten off track in their faith journey. There's always hope for recalibration, for finding our way back to Jesus. And what's amazing is that even though this woman came for physical healing, Jesus gave her so much more. He called her daughter, affirming her identity and her worth, and told her to go in peace, offering her a sense of inner tranquility.
He addressed her emotional and spiritual needs as well, reminding us that true healing is holistic. It's about being made whole in every aspect of our being.
And that reminds me of another sermon that contrasted the woman's life, like before and after her encounter with Jesus, before she was isolated and fearful, trapped in shame.
Like she was living in a prison of her own making.
But after meeting Jesus, her chains were broken, and she was set free to live a new life, a life of freedom and joy and wholeness.
It's a powerful reminder that Jesus came to set us free from everything that holds us captive. Fear, shame, past, hurts, even physical ailments.
Not just set us free, but empower us to walk in that freedom and live a life of purpose. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on one more sermon that really focused on the theme of God's presence.
Oh, yeah, that was a powerful one. It argued that the woman's healing wasn't just a random act of kindness, but a tangible manifestation of God's presence breaking into her situation.
Sometimes we think of God's presence having to be dramatic or spectacular, but this pastor pointed out that it can be a quiet whisper, a gentle nudge, a sense of peace in the midst of chaos.
Just like that woman experienced God's presence through her healing, we can experience it in countless ways. Answered prayers, unexpected blessings, the support of loved ones, even the beauty of nature.
It's a call to pay attention, to be aware of the ways God is working in our lives, even in the seemingly ordinary moments.
Well, I think we've explored just about every angle on Mark 5:25 to 34. I hope you're leaving this deep dive with a fresh perspective on this very familiar story and some creative ideas for your next sermon or study session.
Me too. It's incredible how much depth and richness we can uncover when we really dig into the scriptures and listen to the diverse voices of those who've gone before us.
And as you prepare to share this passage with your congregation or study group, here's a final thought to consider. What unique angle, what fresh perspective will help them encounter this story in a new and meaningful way?
Remember, our goal isn't just to inform, but to transform. Let the story of the woman with the issue of blood inspire you and your listeners to reach out and touch the hem of Jesus' garment, knowing that his healing power is still available today.
Until next time, keep digging deep, keep seeking truth, and keep sharing the good news.